Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our webinar series. We're going to let folks filter into the Zoom room here for the next couple seconds before we get started. I don't want anyone to miss anything. Thanks for joining us. All right. I see folks coming in. Today is a pretty lively news day. So if people joining the webinar are anything like the Fresh Energy staff today, you're combing Twitter and reading everything you can about the news that came out of Congress last night. But today we're going to take a breather and we're going to talk about energy and the arts. And with that, I think I'm going to get started. So thanks everyone for being here. This is the fourth and final installment of Fresh Energy's Energy Plus webinar series. My name is Jo Olson. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Engagement here at Fresh Energy. And if you haven't heard of us, Fresh Energy is a Minnesota-based nonprofit working toward a vision of a just, prosperous, and resilient future powered by a shared commitment to a carbon neutral economy. Now, energy and climate issues play out across our society in books and film, institutions of higher learning, our democracy, and in fact, the very air we breathe. From science fiction to popular Hollywood films, energy and climate are part of the arts today. And today, we are going to discuss how accurate the depictions are and if they can actually spur climate action. But before we get too far along, I just want to thank our generous event sponsors who helped make this webinar series possible. Thank you to Great River Energy for joining us as a gold sponsor and to Sunrun for joining us as a bronze sponsor. And I also want to extend a shout out and thank you to all of our promotional partners who helped spread the word about this event. This list is longer than it ever has been, and we're really grateful for everyone's help spreading the word about this four-part series. Summer is always a really busy time for folks. So yeah, thanks again to everyone here who I'm sure, looking at this list, a bunch of advocates are all celebrating today the potential federal climate action that's coming. But anyway, today, this webinar will be part panel discussion, part Q&A, part presentations. So about the last 15 minutes will be an audience Q&A, but you can submit your question at any time. We're going to be using Zoom's Q&A feature, so look for that button at the bottom of your screen, and then you can type in your questions there. You can even upvote other people's questions that you like. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Anjali Baines. She's the lead director of Energy Access and Equity at Fresh Energy. Take it away, Anjali.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joe. And welcome and thank you to everyone who's joining us today to listen in and participate via your Q&As as we discuss the connections between energy and the arts with our stellar panelists. I'm especially excited to be hosting this discussion about the arts because while I am an energy expert by day, I'm a music lover and cinephile by night, as well as a casual fiction reader, with sci-fi and fantasy being some of my favorite genres, which is all to say I'm very jazzed to be moderating this discussion. And what is it exactly that we are discussing? We are going to be talking about how energy and climate, from science fiction to popular films, are part of the arts today. But how accurate are these depictions and can they spur action? Here with me to help answer those questions are our wonderful panelists, including Naomi Kritzer, an award winning, including a Hugo Award, science fiction and fantasy author hailing from St. Paul, Minnesota. Olga Tchepikova-Treon, a doctoral candidate and graduate instructor in the U of M's Cultural Studies Department. And finally, Ben Weaver, a Minnesota songwriter and poet, to name a few of the many hats he wears. And first, a little bit more about me and the team I serve on at Fresh Energy, the Energy Access and Equity team. Our team is focused on ensuring equity in both process and outcome as we advance clean energy solutions for all Minnesotans. And in my role as lead director, I think a lot about how to make the complex systems we work in more approachable and understandable to different audiences. Energy policymaking can be pretty esoteric and accessible. So, in my work and that of my team, we're always trying to find unique ways to communicate what's happening and bring more people into the discussion so we can ultimately build knowledge across communities on the topics of energy and climate in a way that leads to action and collaboration. That's why I'm so excited to talk to all of you today, since y'all are also doing the work of translating and sharing how our climate and the environment are changing, but through artistic mediums. So today we're going to focus on the work of each of you and discuss how climate and energy is showing up in your respective artistic spaces. So let's kick things off by having each of you take about 5 minutes to tell us a bit about yourselves, your work, and your art, and how climate is woven throughout. Olga, we'll start with you.
Gladly. Hello. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see my panelists, and it's nice to imagine that there's an audience in the Zoom room here too. My name is Olga Tchepikova-Treon. I am a PhD candidate and graduate instructor in the Cultural Studies department at the UMN, where I'm currently writing a dissertation on disability aesthetics in alternative film cultures, which is a kind of film history-oriented project that looks at the non-mainstream experimental and low-budget films and how disability shows up in those. So parallel to this, I also teach cultural studies, media, and film to undergrad students at the U. So upon thinking about how climate change issues show up in my work, my initial impression was really that they don't do it so much or not directly. However, having thought about this more in preparation for today's panel and looked over my materials and things like that, I began finding more and more instances where climate impact and climate awareness are quite frequently a kind of side character or a subtle motivation for a lot of the topics that are at the front and center of the films. So this is true for the films that I'm looking at for my research, but it's also true for the primary examples of films and television series, as well as fiction, nonfiction writing, and some of the music that I choose for discussions in my classes. To give a few brief examples, in my research, some of the historical, alternative, and underground and low budget films that I'm looking at often present pollution and kind of experiments with toxic chemicals in the name of progress and innovation, as it is a common narrative, as primary factors in the ways that future Earth populations of humans and animals too are marked by bodily changes, and these bodily changes will be often presented as so-called deformities or birth defects, or reversely are presented as a kind of new step in human evolution. So these are kind of topics that filmmakers are very aware of, even on the very low budget end of filmmaking that I'm interested in. So parallel to that, in my teaching, I aim to create class communities that are thoroughly concerned with both the ethics and rhetoric of cultural production, where climate often shows up as a topic for discussions of social and political issues. So my students and I in classes talk about the ways public discourses, which is, for example, really any kind of information that is discussed and relayed in a public forum, frame topics like climate change and climate awareness. And we talk about what kind of solutions these public discourses provide and how these solutions are presented to the public. So for instance, we are wondering and kind of inspecting texts for whether or not they put the kind of responsibility of solutions on the individual or on the industry. And in the same vein, we talk about whether personal behavior is a climate issue or is government regulation a climate issue? Is it supposed to be more or less regulation and things like that? But then we also talk about what kind of image these public discourses attach to various actors in this kind of constellation of issues. So what is the image of polluters in the kind of public discourses that we're looking at? What is the image of the critics and activists that are trying to push back against pollution in the public forum? And so the motivation behind inspecting these issues from a variety of perspectives is to critically interrogate the ways that we are presented with this information, and also think about how this information is sinking into our knowledge and what we do with it from there. Thank you.
Wonderful. And that was really interesting. You mentioned the idea of how these stories are demonstrating who holds the power and responsibility over pollution, because I think that is something that is so key and core to the solutions and the future media, is that it is, as much as individual actions matter, it is as much about regulations and the systems, even more so. And so that's really fascinating that you all are making those connections. Next, we're going to be handing over to Ben. Ben, take it away.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, there's something that I'm not good with computers. I'll be transparent. Well, I like to delete my self view, but I don't know how to do that on here. So I got to look at myself while I'm talking to y'all. I can't even see anybody that's out there. Hello. I've gosh, I don't know. I've been doing lots of different things for a long time. But in around 2009, after touring and playing music in pretty traditional ways, going all over the place and being in vans and airplanes and playing in clubs, I just became really sort of disoriented and not happy doing that. And it didn't feel like the way that I was making music and the spaces that I was performing in, I felt like they had anything to do with what my songs were about and my poems and what was in my heart. And so I took a break for a while and then had this idea to start riding my bicycle. So it kind of came out of some quiet time and started putting together these routes that connected different bodies of water in the Midwest, and played shows some of which I organized in advance, some of which I didn't, with different communities, and trying to talk about land, water, and just our relationships in general. And so it's been a long time now of just moving at the pace of the land with my work, I guess is how I think of it, and listening to people that I meet and stories, and really seeing that a lot of the problems about climate change go back to cultural problems that all of us have been, I mean us, these words are so difficult right now, but our relationships are with each other, with the land, with water, with where we come from. I think no matter who we are, that's something that everyone is thinking about and asking questions about now. And there isn't space in the public discourse to talk about that. There isn't space that feels safe. There isn't space that feels that it's not just extractive, that it's not curated, that it's not highly like sort of someone's paying somebody to do something. And I mean, funny, that's what we're doing here, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like, I was looking at spaces and trying to figure out, how do you make room for art to be a thing that is actually part of creating new culture, rather than art being a thing that perpetuates the existing culture that's so tangled into so many of the problems. And like, how do you just make space for people to talk about what's in their heart, about what's going on? How do you make space for us all to be broken together instead of pretending that someone has a solution, or when somebody knows the answer? So I've been working with a lot of different people for quite a while now. I've been working with a really close friend and elder teacher of mine named Strong Buffalo, who runs a nonprofit called Olga Tchepikova-Treon, which is Dakota led. And we've been working through a multicultural lens, bringing different perspectives together and different teachers, and making space and helping open space for people to hear each other. And a lot of it is based in the idea of emergence, and that we just, if we keep moving at this pace that we're moving at, which is historical, it's a historical pace, then nothing new can come in, because we're not making space for anything new to come in. So a lot of what we do looks disorganized to people, and I don't have social media, we don't promote it in the normal channels, because I'm really trying to build something that is actually different. And I guess I can ramble on, abstractly about all of the different things, but I don't think that art is hierarchical, and I think that humans have an incredible capacity. And the problem is that the overculture offers us extremely low level invitations for who we can be. So I'm interested in what happens if, you feed the light with truth.
Wow, thank you so much. That was That's really interesting. And I think if I was hearing you and understanding as you were saying, it occurred to me like the systems that we're talking about that we need to change that have caused issues of climate change and pollution, it's kind of top down, really rigid systems of how we move around, how our food is made, how our homes are built. They can also be applied to things like art, where we tend to think of it as freer, more creative, more free flowing, but can still take more of a consumer, sort of like rigid gatekeeper and being imbued with power and privilege. And how do we, as a transformative element, art can really take us away from those systems and help us think about new ideas, but only if we allow it and create the space and really think in between the systems and the kind of margins and figure out how to do that. So yeah, really, really great insights. Thank you for that. And kind of in that vein of trying something new, I think this is like a first for a webinar from Fresh Energy. We'll actually be having a reading from Naomi from one of her stories. So I'll hand it over to you, Naomi, to introduce the text and take it off.
Great. My name is Naomi Kritzer. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer from St. Paul, Minnesota. And what I thought I would do for my little intro to my work is just to read. This is a very short story, not currently published anywhere, that I wrote the request of something else I'm doing that wanted a story on the theme of beyond narrative. So this is a story that is told in the form of a recipe. And my family makes notes in our cookbooks, like we just, we take a pen and we write down the changes as we make them, so that we can remember future times when we make a recipe, what we did. And so this is a recipe where somebody is doing that, or multiple people are doing that. So I'm going to be telling you where like handwriting is and when the handwriting changes and stuff. So the title is Banana Bread, crossed out. Pumpkin bread, crossed out. Comfort bread. 3 to 4 medium, very ripe bananas. And then in handwriting it says, this recipe was created with Cavendish bananas before they got wiped out. If using Manzano bananas or other tiny variety, use 9. February 2042. Made with Manzano bananas as treat for Gina's 12th birthday. 1 cup sugar. February of 43. If sugar hard to get, reduce to 1/2 cup. November of 43. Substitute 1/4 cup maple syrup. Larkin will give you a jug if you help boil sap. 1/3 cup margarine or butter softened, or any neutral oil. 2 eggs, or 2 flax eggs / other egg substitute. 1/3 cup water. 1 2/3 cups all-purpose flour. February of 44. Tried cornmeal due to flour shortage. Do not repeat. February of 44. Buckwheat worked, heavier than normal flour, but okay. August of 44. Gina tried with rice flour, was okay. Different handwriting. This is Gina's handwriting. August 44. Was not okay. Very dry and weird. First handwriting again. December 45. Don't buy buckwheat flour from Glenn. He doesn't mill it right or cuts it with something. June of 47. Gina's handwriting. Glenn's acorn flour does at least bake into bread. November of 47. Ground those dried puffball mushrooms Gina foraged into flour. Everyone said they liked the results. Gina thinks they were just hungry. July of 48. Used the first barley flour from the winter crop for some maple squash bread to celebrate making it through the last year. 1 teaspoon baking soda, Gina's handwriting. Tom makes reliable baking soda and will trade it for occasional baked goods. 1 teaspoon salt. December of 44. Used a nutmeg grater on that Himalayan salt lamp. Resulting salt worked fine. 1/4 teaspoon baking powder. Can substitute extra tiny pinch of baking soda. Directions. Mash bananas, cream, sugar, and butter. Beat in wet ingredients, then add dry ingredients. Bake in greased loaf pan 350 F for 1 hour, 15 minutes. For pumpkin bread, use 1 cup pumpkin instead of bananas. Add 1 teaspoon cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon nutmeg, 1/4 teaspoon cloves. And then in handwriting. Or 2 teaspoons pumpkin pie spice. April of 46, Gina's writing. Not bad with just the pumpkin. August 46. Tried with finely ground dried rosemary, was not a fan. November of 46. Tried with juniper. Better than rosemary, at least. November of 48, Gina's handwriting. 1/4 teaspoon dried ground ginger. Jackie grows ginger in pots and will supply a small jar of dried ginger to everyone who helps move her plants into the greenhouse for the winter. February of 49. Tom gave Gina some Texas cinnamon. Really is best with 1/4 teaspoon cinnamon. July of 46, Gina's handwriting. Tried with solar oven. Ugh. July of 46, the original writer's handwriting. Solar oven instructions, you just need to be very, very patient. Recipe said 3 hours, took 5. Maybe it wasn't sunny enough when Gina tried. Do the skewer test, just leave in as long as it needs. Dutch oven, more predictable. August of 46, Gina's handwriting. Zucchini option, 1½ cups grated zucchini, 1/4 cup maple syrup. Do not omit maple syrup or the bread will taste like side vegetables. November 46, Gina's handwriting again. Squash bread. Louise says canned pumpkin was acorn squash all along and she was right. Make with acorn squash. Carrot bread, August of 50. 1½ cups finely grated carrot, 1/4 cup maple syrup, way better if you can get cinnamon. Apple bread, September of 52. 1½ cups grated apple, 2 tablespoons maple syrup, 1/4 teaspoon cinnamon. Cinnamon showed up from Texas just in time to bake this to celebrate Samantha's arrival, September 23rd, 2052. Congratulations, Gina and Tom. Beet bread, September of 56. Gina's handwriting. Like carrot bread, but pink, made for Sammy's 4th birthday. 1½ cups finely grated beets, 1/4 teaspoon cinnamon, 1/4 cup maple syrup. Was pretty good. Mom's handwriting again. Turnip bread might have worked with more maple syrup. And then Gina's handwriting. Let's not delude ourselves into wasting maple syrup on another try. And then another handwriting entirely. March 2093. This was my grandma's special occasion bread. She always made it with maple syrup, buckwheat flour, and cooked acorn squash. Works fine with canned pumpkin and 1/2 cup sugar. Cut buckwheat 50% with all-purpose flour. Increase cinnamon to 1 teaspoon. Cool before slicing, share with friends. And that's the end of the story.
Wow, that was really fantastic, Naomi. Really creative, and I mean, I would love to, if we have a couple minutes here, I'd love to have you sort of share what inspired that and what sort of the meaning, if any, you would like the listener to take away from that.
So essentially, I thought for a long time about like, so we make notes in our cookbooks, right? And sometimes we substitute ingredients, sometimes we substitute because we're out of something, sometimes because something's hard to get, sometimes just because we think it might be better with this other thing. And so I thought about like, if you, if somebody a generation out picked up one of our recipes and if something wasn't available anymore due to climate change or due to other environmental stuff, like bananas are genetically, they're all clones. Basically, the bananas we have are single variety. They'd be very, very vulnerable to like just getting wiped out. So that's how the story starts, is that like banana bread has become like way more difficult to make because bananas have become much harder to get. And like, and then, so the story tells us, I mean, the recipe changes, tell the story of like civilization, like kind of falling off a cliff. Things have gone really, really wrong somehow. And a lot of the things that we take for granted are much more difficult to get. And then slowly, like, things kind of come back. And like by the end, you're seeing people talk about how like, you could just use the canned pumpkin again, instead of talking about like, what you can grow and use, what you can like, how, and of course the cinnamon is now like at the end of the story, you just put in a teaspoon because you're no longer treating it as this special, precious special occasion thing. But I did a bunch of research into like, of like baking spices that you might use to flavor something like pumpkin bread or banana bread. Like what could we grow like close to home in Minnesota? What would we be able to grow domestically if like imports just stopped being a thing? We could not grow cinnamon. Well, I think there's cinnamon growing in the conservatory over in like Como Park, but like that would not be like, that would be, very, very limited quantities. So, but ginger, you could actually grow ginger here. You just have to like baby it. So,
Wow.
Anyway, so that was sort of like, that was that was where I was trying to tell the story of like of a disaster told through food and told through like the notes people were taking in the moment. And yeah, I hope it was possible to follow. The dates jump around a little the way they do when you're taking notes. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's even, I think the fact that you even said it aloud and I was able to follow that arc you mentioned, I think the fact that you even reference this barter economy that's clearly sprung up after something, you get the sense that something has failed, the infrastructure has fallen apart, and then there's this more community-based way of trading foods and helping each other out and trying to figure out how to make things as treats for people in these kind of hard times, and that definitely comes through. So thank you so much for sharing
thank you.
that. Wow. So I feel like we know each of you so much better and drives each of you much better as well. We're going to transition now to a roundtable conversation. I have some questions I want us to tackle here first, and then I know we'll be getting some great questions in the Q&A, which is also my reminder to the audience to ask away using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. It should be right by the chat button. There should be a Q&A button as well. So this is a part where I ask each of you to zoom out a little bit more and make some generalized commentary on your respective fields. I'm interested specifically in your perspectives as established artists and creatives. So Olga, we're gonna start with you again. In our planning conversation, you mentioned the film industry's rising consciousness and self-consciousness about energy conservation and environmental impact. I'm sure you've seen this both in your research and hearing from students in your classes. So could you dig a little bit deeper into that for our audience?
Absolutely, I'm so happy to do that. Yeah, so as a film scholar, I'm interested in both the contents of the films that we watch, but also to a great extent in the kind of behind the scene mechanics of the industry and then the technologies that are used to actually make the films. And so the general gist that I'm getting from my students whenever environmental concerns about filmmaking specifically come up in conversation is that their go-to opinion and kind of perspective is that digital filmmaking has greatly reduced the environmental impact of the film industry. And there are important reasons for this intuitive suggestion that the students are making. And so on the one hand, when we think about the materiality of filmmaking, which is concerned with the actual physical materials that are involved in filmmaking procedures, we know that there's a historical trajectory from using analog film stock and kind of photochemical development processes to digital filmmaking. And we know that traditional photochemistry has been a great kind of environmentally destructive phenomenon, that photochemistry is toxic, it's pollutive, and although film stock is not or no longer really the dominant or preferred format for the kind of larger scale entertainment industry production procedures, we are still feeling the environmental impact of these procedures that have been going on for about a century. So that said, the switch to digital filmmaking is not a magical cure for this, because a lot of what is being overlooked in this perspective is that since the digital equipment that is needed for film production also relies on kind of same but different photochemicals and other toxic chemicals that are involved in creating digital technologies, and also these devices are using up a vast amount of energy. So this is one thing. The other thing is the filmmaking process itself, where we can also kind of establish a trajectory from analog to digital. And if we think about older films and the way the special effects were organized in older films pre-CGI and pre-digital age, we think about things like pyrotechnics and other physical effects whose impact on the environment are kind of very visible and it's like a real event that happens. In order to film an explosion, you have to make an explosion. And then you see the fire and the clouds, and you have this kind of material evidence of the harmful things that are being done to the environment in order to create the special effect. This is not necessarily true anymore with digital effects, but again, this kind of impact of digitally creating these visual materials is invisible, but not necessarily less impactful than the actual physical and material effects, because the computing power that is necessary for the production of these effects, and the distribution of them too is not particularly eco-friendly either. So the bottom line of this brief overview is that film is a thoroughly unnatural and in many ways also not ecologically friendly form of entertainment. That said, the film industry is of course aware of this environmental impact and has put procedures into place in order to begin remedying these issues through something like the system of environmental certification that is being put into place for film production. So for instance, there are actors, not actors as in a person that acts on screen, but kind of human agents, let's say, who are environmental consultants who go to film sets and observe the procedures on film sets to make recommendations for more sustainable filmmaking practices with regard to things like the use of power, the way that waste is being managed on film sets, and any number of other things. So it's a kind of give and take in an industry that at large still remains, unfortunately, largely non-eco-friendly.
Wow, yeah, that is really interesting. Especially, I'm glad you bring up the point that digital doesn't necessarily mean, just because it's using less maybe physical materials doesn't mean it's less wasteful or less kind of energy intensive. As you mentioned, all the digital effects we see nowadays have to be processed somewhere, so that you see all these data centers going up and they have to be powered by something which, ideally would be solar or wind energy, but oftentimes would be natural gas or, coal in this parts of the country. That's still kind of the main operating power. So really glad you lay that out for us. And then we're gonna switch back to Ben. So kind of following what we've just been talking about, it seems clear that personally climate has been such a motivator. And as you mentioned, there was a period of time where you're doing a lot of biking, which led to that Star Tribune piece from a few years back when you were biking around Lake Superior. But I'm wondering now if you have any perspectives and insight on trends you've seen in the music industry or other industries your work touches more broadly. And I think you mentioned some of that of your own journey away from sort of being in venues, traveling to play music and doing it through biking and then doing it more in community. So if you could continue sharing more about that transformation and the kind of trends you're seeing.
Sure. I mean, I feel like my age really shows too, because I'm not that old, but I'm like, I don't know anything that's going on in kind of the mainstream music world anymore very, very well. I know that I'm surprised, like as shows have opened up. I have a 16-year-old son, so I've taken him to a few larger shows, and I just, I'm speaking here just as a human, like not as anyone who knows anything more than anyone else in this group that's gathered. Like, it's just really struck me that promoters and venues and like watching the way that things kind of surged up again after like things quote unquote went back to normal, and everyone started going on tour again. It's like, it was like, that's almost one of the greatest testaments to the fact that like you can use a bunch of language and you can talk about a bunch of stuff, but like if you're still getting in a tour bus and you're still bringing like a huge road crew, and there's like an enormous amount of comfort and privilege in people who have reached the level of notoriety that most people think of when you go to a concert. And I totally am cool with being someone who sounds like I have a negative opinion of those people. I more am just critical of like, at what point are we really truly going to decide to make different relationships? And like, that's not something that I have control over for anyone else. And I've gone through my own personal transformation of recognizing that I can't hold a concert or an event or a speaking engagement with any other intention other than just like sharing what I've learned or what I've experienced. And that if that has an impact on somebody else, then that's wonderful. But I don't have the power to change anyone else or to decide what is the right way to do things. I have my own intuition, which a lot of that is informed by my relationship with being outside. And as I have spent more and more time outside, which I always have, I learn more and more, and I deepen my resource and connection with, like, you know, I call them my ancestors. I don't, and lineage is not just like our familial lineage, so to speak. So when I look at the music industry now, like I just don't really understand like why people aren't making more. You know, there's like these kind of greening things where like Pearl Jam has like zero waste or whatever at their concert, but it's sort of like, if we set the whole city up with solar power, that's like, maybe we need to do that because it's a short-term fix, but all the solar power in the world doesn't change the relationship. And if the relationship is extractive and not reciprocal, then it doesn't really matter. And so I think that's something that I have a lot of just personal grief around, this intuition that you can work. Actually, there's a really great Anishinaabe scholar named Kyle White who wrote a really important article called Climate Injustice. And he looks at, yeah, you could go as fast as you possibly can to lower the carbon to below 350 parts per million. And maybe you can do that. Or you can look at what is the work that needs to be done to do reparations and to do the healing on a cultural level. That's going to take way longer. But the difference in outcome is that if you race to lower the carbon to below 350, then you still have all of the same broken relationships between people and land and water. And if you go the route of reparations, then that might take a lot longer and there may be way more carbon in the atmosphere, but at least you have an intact culture that you can then face whatever is going on. And I think that speaks really loudly to me about truth. And like, so that's why a lot of just sort of mainstream culture, and especially in the music industry and in the outdoor world, don't resonate very loudly with me, because I don't see a lot of people, you know, I don't see enough people taking really radical steps. And I know there are lots of people doing things out on the edges. And so that's where I'm more curious and interested in sort of like what's happening despite all the impositions of the driving culture that still just like won't let go.
Yeah, no, well said. And I think to your point about, you can look at one metric and think we've had success because we reduce climate emissions in this many ways by this time frame, but it's not really solving the larger. We have an opportunity to solve the larger injustices and problems of society, and it might take more time, but also just might take more time now, but then still get us to where we need to go, because we have more resilient communities and healthier communities, like you said, who can actually take in those impacts and have the means and resources and kind of power to handle what's coming next. Yeah, thank you so much for those insights. So we've covered film and music. So let's head over to the book industry with you, Naomi. You've been a sci-fi and fantasy author for more than 20 years and have a Hugo, Lodestar, and Edgar Award under your belt, not to mention a Minnesota Book Award. So what are your perspectives on the sci-fi and fantasy genres? I know there's even a new genre out there nowadays called cli-fi that may have always existed, but has gotten its own name now.
Yeah. So science fiction fictionally has been grappling with climate change for a really long time. Marge Piercy's He, She, and It, published in 1991, had a had a warmed world as just a backdrop. Like, that was part of what was going on in the story. And increasingly, I think writers are writing about either a world that is warmed or a world that is mitigating, or both. There's a book and it's frequently, sometimes it's just as part of the backdrop of the story. I read a book recently called The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. And that's a world in which global warming is just, you know, has happened, and they are living with the results in the story. But there's a book that just came out called The Half-Built Garden by Ruth Anna Emrys, which is a book in which repairs are being made to the world. It's a half-built garden because they're not done, but like humanity kind of got together and is cooperating and is, working to, repair the harms done to the world. And that's when the aliens show up and are like, actually, we think we should just move you out completely. And so it's a story about sort of a fight over like, do we keep trying to fix things? Do we keep working together, or do we just say like goodbye and go off to the stars, which is what the aliens think we should be doing? And that, I haven't read it yet because it just came out, but I heard an excerpt read at a convention I went to a couple months ago, and I highly recommend it. It's for anyone who's interested in like science fiction and climate topics, because that's very much what this book is about. In fantasy, you see a lot of use of climate, as things that are metaphors for climate change, like one of the classic ones being Game of Thrones. But one of the things that I think is worth noting is that all science fiction and fantasy, people think science fiction is about the future. And it's really about the present, like it's always about the present. And it's about people like writing about what they see and what they see as a threat and what they see as a danger and what's like worrying them and keeping them up at night. And like, so yeah, I mean, everyone writing is kind of constantly aware of what's going on in the world, right? So like, there's a lot that's even stuff that's not directly about climate change is like grappling with a world where it's happening.
Yeah, well said. I think I was reading Blade Runner, or the original book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and it so much had this like post-climate change, or if something's happened and the world is polluted and all the rich people have left the earth and everyone else there's like some people who's left who can't leave. But yeah, to your point, it's as much about our present as it is about sort of imagining the future. So, well.
And just to address something I see in the chat, The Space Between Worlds came out just a couple years ago. It came out in like 2020, I think. The 1991 book is called He, She, and It by author Marge Piercy.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Naomi. So to me, art is being created around climate change and, to me, the art being created around climate change and that is influenced by climate change heightens the reality and intensity of what's happening by calling us to connect with our senses and emotions. As artists and folks immersed in the arts, how do you think the arts that you're all involved with can inspire climate action? And Olga, we'll start with you again.
Yeah. Well, as a storytelling medium, film, much like music and science fiction and any kind of storytelling kind of procedure, provides us with an opportunity to try on different scenarios regarding the future, regarding the present, et cetera, et cetera. And with film, we do that from like the safe position of the spectator, where we don't actually have to deal with the consequences that are being presented to us in the story world. But one significant difference, I think, between film and other media is that film kind of reduces your own kind of imagination of the respective scenario. It kind of gives you an audiovisual world that is kind of complete in itself, where your own interpretation of it is somewhat reduced. That said, across the board in the kind of film storytelling trajectory and history, I think it would be fair to, for the sake of conversation and argument right now, to set up a dichotomy or trends that are kind of happening in this environment of storytelling. And one is the kind of human-centric way of storytelling about environment and climate, which is a cultural interpretation of the issue, which means that these narratives will be more concerned with the effects of ecological decay on the quality of human life. And the opposite of that is the environment-centric perspective, where the human impact on ecological decay is more at the front and center. And a lot of films, as well as stories, et cetera, provide us with a kind of mixed perspective that contains both the human-centric and the environment-centric elements. And these exist across the board of film genres that comment implicitly or explicitly on environmental impact. And I think regarding genres, it's important to realize the diversity of genres that exists, right? So on the one hand, in one kind of corner. On the one extreme spectrum, we have films that are apocalyptic, commonly called eco-horror films is a whole genre. There are enough movies about ecological catastrophes to have established the eco-horror genre as a genre. Then at a different point of the spectrum, we have, of course, the documentary films that are, attempting to show us the truth of the actual change that is happening in the world, that is not kind of modified in one way or another. Though documentary as a truth-telling genre is also something that needs to be discussed more thoroughly and more critically. However, there's also a completely different and I think somewhat unexpected field of genres that are engaging these topics in ways that are not very obvious or immediate. And these are films that are primarily comedy or humor films. A lot of films for children are addressing these topics in ways that seem fun to children, but kind of very serious and devastating to adults. WALL-E is a very good example of that, where, it's a kind of funny, cute little movie, but the story world that is being set up in this movie is really devastating. And so I think the diversity of the ways that film art addresses the topic of environmentalism is important, because different spectators are receptive to different kinds of strategies for thought provocation, right? Some people have a stronger reaction to images of truth that are being relayed by something like documentary films, while other spectators respond better to subtlety that kind of provokes their own thinking without giving them a definite direction to go into. And it motivates spectators to, embark on a journey of self-education on a topic, and maybe, results in certain changes of behavior without, precisely because the people are not feeling like they're being told that they need to do things in a certain way or another.
Oh yeah, and I think what you're saying about how different people have different ways of taking information and different things will motivate them, whether it's satire or kind of quote unquote truth telling in documentary, or something more kind of ambiguous and metaphorical that'll let them ponder. I think that's really important to understand, because I'll admit I'm not actually. I've always wondered if because we're in this space, working in this space day in and day out, I'm not someone who particularly enjoys watching movies that is directly about climate change or environmental destruction. So when Don't Look Up came out, there was many reasons why I didn't particularly enjoy that movie, but I remember watching it and feeling incredibly anxious during all of it, even as my family was finding it like darkly humorous. So yeah, there's a really good point that people take in different things differently. So Ben, we're gonna go over to you and the world of arts and music that you're part of. How do you think the arts can inspire climate action?
I think one of the biggest things is just imagination. And like I said earlier, when I was introducing myself, just the concept of emergence and what do we do in our lives that make us walk to work a different way, or like get out of bed on the other side, or whatever cliched simple things even that you can change that make you look differently at what's in front of you. So I think the more that art can be seen as not like an institutionalized thing, not part of the academy, that it's actually maybe one of the places where some of the most important pieces of what it means to be in a human body like exist, and that we all have the ability to connect with those parts of ourselves, and that through those processes, or I don't know what the word is, that we can potentially see different ways, we can imagine different things, we can create language. It's so difficult to talk with the English language, because at this point in time, it almost feels like the words have been stripped of their meaning and can't resist the market, and I think that's part of postmodernism and what's happened. So like when you when you say art, it's like what does that mean? It only means what its value is, but we have to change what that value is so that the word can start to mean something different, that includes our ability to connect with each other, to express ourselves, and and to do that together, not just like watch an elite few express themselves and then all of the rest of us wonder like, how did they get that ability to do that? I mean, it's like anyone can do anything that you focus your time on to some degree, right? I mean, obviously certain people have more advantage and privilege than others, but I think art has a lot of possibility for bringing us into new spaces.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Yeah, like the idea that anyone can do art. Like there is no prescribed way of doing art. If you want to pick up a pencil and draw something, that is art to you, and there's no one who should be telling you that's not. But we do all. It's very easy to get stuck in our own fears of like trying something that's outside of our norms, and we perceive it as being part of this sort of world that we think, oh, the people who are artists are doing it, and I can listen, I can consume it, but I can't be part of it, and that's not true.
And I think Naomi's recipe story on many levels is a perfect example. I mean, like you can't listen to that story and not like imagine a whole lot of different things, even just down to what are those people feeling when they're substituting these different pieces and it's attached to handwriting on a piece of paper that came from the time before, you know. So I think that is a great example of how art can start to like shake us up and make us think differently.
Very well said. And we are going back to Naomi. So last but not least, Naomi, what are your thoughts here about arts and your art inspiring climate action?
I feel like there's kind of like three pieces to inspiring climate action through stories. The first is the why. There are a lot of stories out there that are like warning stories, right? Like they're like, look, this is bad. This is where we're headed. Like we need to like change what we're doing, or like this is what we're going to get. This is what it'll actually look like. You know, this is what it'll actually look like for your grandchildren if we don't, you know, if we don't make some changes. So there's the warning stories, which are sort of the why. And then the second piece is the what, and that's the alternative vision, and that's the vision of like the, you know, if we do change, things could look like this. And those are the stories that are the hopeful stories. That are the stories of like, you know, we have made changes, we have like improved things, and now that's what that looks like. And this is a vision for a better world. This is like, you know, we get at this point, actually, I feel like we're seeing a lot less of the warning stories because like I think everyone at this point knows what it's going to look like, you know, like, and that's, if anything, like we have to sort of provide sort of an antidote to, there's no point in even trying to change, might as well like, you know, live it up and, you know, not worry about tomorrow because it's too late to fix anything. Like we want to provide the visions for like, you know, no, like look over there is a path to like, you know, that's the future we want to move towards. That's the future we could live in, like that we could want our children and grandchildren to get to live in. And the third piece of this is the how, right? And like, and those are the stories that are like about work and about building community and about struggle and about not giving up. And like, and there are a lot of stories like that are like, that piece of the narrative that show people coming together, that show people working with each other and like finding ways to like move into the future they want. And I feel like all three of those pieces are helpful and help to motivate people. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll have to get the recommendations from you on the stories that are showing the hopeful future and what we can achieve. I think I need to read some of those. So yeah, thank you all. I really enjoyed this conversation so far. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here and sharing each of your really unique perspectives on the energy and the arts. Before we dive into the audience Q&A, I see one person's asked a question. I encourage more folks to pop in and ask questions. We're going to do a lightning round of recommendations or reflections on art that we are currently engaging with and consuming. So I can go first as y'all take a think about this. I actually recently finished a fantasy book called The Magician's Land, which came out in 2015 and which ended with, spoiler, a beloved magical land being saved as it was literally in the throes of an apocalypse. But the book makes clear that even though it was saved, the damage that was wrought by the apocalypse won't all magically disappear, that things really can't go back to exactly how they used to be, and that a new era had begun with many things needing to be rethought and rebuilt. And actually, in the book, they basically say there's got to be no top down power now saying what has to happen. So it's up to the people to decide what to happen. And the saving of this land was not possible without real sacrifice. So that, of course, had me thinking about climate change and how we're already seeing massive changes to our lives and landscapes, and how we can come out of it, but not without drastic change to how we live our lives and swift action on our part, and a stalwart determination that we can work together to do better and should do better. That was kind of a big reflective piece from my end. But I'll turn it back to you all now. What's something you're reading, watching, writing, or consuming, hosting, etc., in any other way right now that's influencing how you approach climate justice, and our energy in your work? Let's aim for 60 seconds each. And Olga, we'll start with you again.
I remembered to unmute myself. Sorry about that. Yes, so my list is very long, but I'll just pick a few items. In terms of newer films, films that have really provoked my thinking or provoked different directions in my thinking are, on the one hand, a film called Annihilation by Alex Garland from 2018, which deals with the kind of human resistance to natural evolution that is happening, more or less, without giving away any spoilers. And then the other very unexpected film that provoked my thoughts was Paul Schrader's First Reformed, also from 2018, that deals with the kind of personal emotional devastation for caring and being an activist of environmental issues in a place and time when it seems like no one else is. And now to give a little more historical trajectory to other film examples, the historical trajectory is definitely there. If you look at film history, so many works are commenting on environmental issues throughout the decades. And one thing that was very surprising to me was to come to the realization that actually the original Godzilla movies have a lot to say about environmental change and environmental impact, a very strong critique of human greed and the use of nuclear energy and the possibility of nuclear annihilation. They talk a lot about biodiversity and climate change too. So this is very interesting. And the last thing I'll say is a book about film history for those people who are interested in getting a kind of written overview about these issues in general. And it's David Ingram's book called Green Screen: Environmentalism in Hollywood Cinema. And the title is very revealing of its content. It's really literally about how environmentalism has been treated in both the Hollywood industry on screen and off.
Thank you so much, Olga. I'm going to take a look at those recommendations. Over to Ben. Anything you're reading, watching, participating in? Do you want to share?
Sure. My friend Josna Harris has an organization called Change Narrative and is doing some really important and beautiful work like in the community, specifically here in town, working with people on their climate stories. And she has a series coming up that's part of the Minnesota Fringe Festival. It's in August, called Changing the Narrative: Climate Stories for Justice. And I can put the link in the chat. I don't know if I'm able to, but there's 5 different shows between August 5th and 12th, I think it is, that people can go to. And yeah, I think what she's doing is really great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And last but not least, Naomi, anything you want to share?
So I am a big fan of the work of Ursula Vernon, who also writes as T. Kingfisher. She had a book that came out earlier this year under the T. Kingfisher name called Nettle and Bone. As Ursula, she wrote a graphic novel series called Digger. And almost all her books are basically about work and stubbornness saving the world. And not work done by the chosen one. Like the characters are like the person who like chose themselves and did the work because it was there, and because they, and they often, in many cases, they sort of start down the path of saving the world with no idea how they're going to do it. They're like, I need to do this thing. I'm going to try to do this thing, and I don't know how I'm going to do this thing. And like they survive and succeed through like, the power of friendship and hard work and community. And yeah, they're great books. So highly recommended.
Awesome, wonderful. And I realize we are coming up to the hour. So for anyone who can stay a little longer, I think we'll try at least do 1 or 2 of the Q&As. But I'll hand over to Joe Olson quickly to give some announcements.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. So for those of you listening today, this webinar will also be available on YouTube and on Fresh Energy's podcast, which you can find just by searching Decarbonize the Clean Energy Podcast on basically all podcasting apps at this point. And we'll be sending out an email at the end of the series, which is, I guess, today. So I'll probably do it tomorrow, if I'm being honest, with links to all the other elements of our 4-part series. And while we're on the subject of events, I just want to remind folks that registration is now open for Fresh Energy's virtual benefit breakfast. It's on October 13th, and it features Julian Brave Noisecat. He's a nationally acclaimed journalist and thought leader who has become an absolute force for climate action across movements, and you can register at Fresh Energy's website. And then finally, for the first time ever, Fresh Energy has created some cool branded socks. They're wool. They're from a cycling sock company, so they're pretty awesome, and they celebrate wind, solar, and clean energy. Everyone who donates $50 to Fresh Energy by the end of the month can get their very own pair. And then just a reminder about how to use the Q&A, but I think everyone knows how to do that at this point. So back to you, Anjali.
Wonderful. And thank you all to the panelists, anyone who can stay on to listen to a couple more questions. This will also be recorded and posted on our podcast, Decarbonize. So for those of you who have to leave, you can come back and listen to the Q&A through that as well. So we're actually going to start off with a question from T that she put it into the chat. And I'll just read it out loud, and then I'll share it out. I'm curious kind of from all the panelists what your thoughts are in this particular question. So T's question is, frontline communities are hardest hit from the impacts of climate change. How do you use arts to move these negative impacts to these communities, to educate these communities, to those communities hardest hit, and raise awareness to communities that are more adapted to climate change? So really, how can art be a way of, if I'm interpreting this correctly, how can art be used to shift some of that power and education towards communities more impacted by climate change, and let the communities who are starting to adapt also understand that there is an opportunity to support these other communities with sharing of solutions? I actually think, Ben, what you were just sharing with Jasna might be, that actually did come to mind as an example of trying to bring that change of narratives and stories to the communities who are most impacted. If you want to share anything more about that particular event.
Sure. I mean, I can try. I think one of the discrepancies that I notice is that, well, like with the people that Josna has brought in and does a lot of her work with, that I'm familiar with at least, I think there's a lot of people on the front line who are impacted by climate that their story doesn't, people don't think that it's climate change, because the people who are more affluent and are and like, forget the word that this to T's question referenced, but are more adaptable. There's these different narratives. Like, it's like, I think it's shifting, but climate change is more than like, it's just really hot outside, you know, or like you can't get the things that you wanted at the store. And what I see in Josna's work is that when people are given space to like process and support to talk about like their own stories, then what is climate change and how it's showing up starts to get a lot broader, and then those people can become more empowered because their story has weight and it's not just one overarching story that's being told. I mean, I don't know, this is I think a pretty broad response, but I guess I feel like there's not enough white-bodied people talking about how racism is, and like, I'm going to use Resmaa Memekin's language here, like white body supremacy is a humongous part of the systematic things that continue to move on. So for people in more affluent and who have resources, financial resources, to be able to adapt, like, they also, I think, need to be doing the cultural work to understand, like, how they contribute, how their power situation contributes to the problem. And I think that's where storytelling, I think in both areas, storytelling is potentially one of the strongest art forms to help people see and understand, because then it's not, well, it's honest, I guess, and story can go wherever people are. I don't know. I don't feel super clear on what I'm saying, but I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, I think it is helpful, and it's not necessarily something that has like a point A to point B
Right.
response. So I appreciate that response. Olga and Naomi, anything to comment on about how we can use arts to kind of highlight the negative impacts to communities who are most impacted by climate change and also support solutions for them?
The thing I would add to this is just to encourage people to seek out fiction written by people from other communities. It's fiction, and there's fiction that was written by people who are living on the front lines of climate change, who are not white, who are not American, and there's a lot out there, but they're when you're coming from a position of not a lot of privilege, your work tends to get less attention. And so I feel like sort of the thing I would recommend here is that people seek it out and talk about it and recommend it to friends and things like that.
Great, thank you. Olga?
Yeah, I think it is not a bad idea to start using the rhetoric of overdevelopment in a lot of the ways that we tell stories about, the hierarchical arrangement of people who have access to a comfortable life at the expense of very environmentally non-friendly issues. But while this is one kind of rhetorical move, I think a general kind of education about also the complexity of how entangled and global this issue has become, and that communities of affluence versus communities of destitute in different places who are all still affected by the same thing experience these things in very different ways. And I have been thinking very hard about do I know specifically in the filmic realm, do I know examples that are addressing these kinds of issues? And maybe this is the limitation of something like film, right? That you can't really actually grasp it in an adequate way in the amount of time that people are willing to give their attention to something like the medium film. But I think, through rhetoric and certain words, it would be a good start to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. And last question here from Noelle. Have any of you seen any good examples of artists using public art installations to engage the public about climate change or sustainability? Any public art installations y'all have come across, I guess either in Minnesota or anywhere else if you've traveled recently?
I have a good one. My friend Marina Tesplina, who is a disability focused artist in New York City, and it makes puppets that are specifically focused on embodying disability. She calls them disabled puppets. There's a forest that we've been working on up in the northwest corner of Montana in the Yak Valley. That's one of the last very unique old growth forest that's now slated for clear cut. And she made this beautiful puppet that was all made out of natural materials and took it up there and installed it in the forest. And it was actually on the cover of Orion magazine from, I think it was last winter, I can't remember, but you can go look at Orion magazine, and it was the edition of that magazine that was all focused around disabled ecology. So there's some really interesting stuff there. That was not necessarily public in the sense that people could go visit it, because it was in a really remote place, but it was she's doing a lot of engagement in New York City, connecting climate and forests and disabled ecology. So that comes to mind.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the recommendation. It looks like Joe managed to find a link and put it in the chat for anyone else who wants to follow up with that particular artist. Naomi or Olga, any public art installations you've come across?
I can't think of any. I love public art, and but if you ask me what have you seen that you liked, I'm like, yeah, I have no idea. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm really not plugged into the public art scene locally or really regionally or anything like that. But one thing that did come to my mind in response to this with regard to film is not necessarily something that's publicly available, but something that was very interesting for me to learn about in terms of thinking about the kind of conundrum of like, so I'm against my better judgment, I'm really an analog film affiliate. Like I like playing with Super 8 cameras and all that stuff. And I was part of a kind of group that where we got an opportunity to try out different organic ways of developing chemical film stock. So in theory, it is possible to actually, join those two things. There's also like film development with beer and a lot of other kind of funky ways. But there are ways that you can actually engage this medium that is supposed to be super toxic in like more eco-friendly ways. And I know one of my friend film artists from the Twin Cities, whose name is Sam Houlihan, has a lot of expertise and knowledge about this topic. So I would recommend looking to his art maybe also.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I know this exhibit has already closed and it's not public art installation, but I know someone at Fresh Energy had gone to an exhibit at the American Swedish Institute that was very specifically about climate change. The link is in the chat, although I think it is over, but that was probably the only example I could come up with. Anyway, thank you all so much for joining us here today. On behalf of everyone at Fresh Energy, thank you for attending part 4 of our Energy Plus webinar series. And thank you especially to our panelists, Olga, Naomi, and Ben. A recording of this webinar will be posted at freshenergy.org/publications and on our podcast, Decarbonize, the Clean Energy Podcast, which is available on all podcasting platforms. You can also learn more about Fresh Energy's work at www.fresh-energy.org. And you can subscribe to our newsletter, check out our latest blog, and make a donation today at the website. So again, I just want to emphasize how much I enjoy this conversation. I hope the audience as well. I hope the panelists, you all really enjoyed our conversation. This is a lovely way to spend a Thursday. So thank you all so much for your time, and we'll see everyone later. Bye, everyone.